The morning the hatchery truck pulled up my lane, it was the second Tuesday of April 2019, and the frost had come in overnight. So thin and mean, it looked like somebody had breathed on the fields and forgotten to wipe them clean. 29 degrees on the thermometer nailed to the porch post, and the sky was the color of old tin, that flat gray you get in early spring when the season can't decide whether it's coming or going. I stood there in my coveralls with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand and watched the driver back a fish hauler tank down toward my new pond, and I remember thinking there was no dignity in it, none at all. A woman of 63 standing in the cold about to pay good money for 9,000 fish smaller than her little finger. The driver was a polite young fellow who kept calling me "ma'am," and he had a clipboard, and he said, real careful, like he was trying not to hurt my feelings, that most folks who put in a pond that size stocked bass and catfish and maybe a handful of bluegill for the bass to eat, not 9,000 of them. Not bluegill as the whole point. He said it like a question he was too well-mannered to finish. And I told him I knew what I was doing, which was mostly a lie, because at that hour of that morning, I did not fully know what I was doing. I only knew what my father had known, and he had been dead 11 years. And all I had of his knowing was a notebook and a memory of him standing in almost this exact spot, telling me something I hadn't understood at the time. 9,000 bluegill fingerlings, at 11 cents a fish, came to $990, and I had paid it out of an envelope in the kitchen drawer that was supposed to have lasted me through the summer. The man from the county extension office had come out 2 weeks before that, a nice enough young man in a Carhartt jacket so clean it still had the fold lines in it, and he had walked my 40 acres with a tablet computer and told me, in the gentle voice they use on old women, that my ground was wrong for what I wanted. He said the market for bluegill was thin. He said the growers around here all ran bass ponds and catfish operations, and that a pond stocked entirely with bluegill would take 3 years to reach any size worth harvesting, and by then I'd have spent more on feed than I'd ever see back. He gave me a number, he said, and I remember it, exactly because a number like that stays with you, that I would be lucky to clear $400 a year off that pond. And that $400 was being generous. Then he put his tablet away and said he had another appointment, and he drove off in a truck that had never once been stuck in mud. And that was the last I saw of him. He meant well. I want to be honest about that. He wasn't cruel, and he wasn't wrong about the arithmetic he could see. He just wasn't the kind of man who stays long enough to see the arithmetic he couldn't. By that afternoon, the story had already gotten to the diner in town, the way these things do. And by the time I went in for a slice of pie on Thursday, it had grown. The version they had at the counter was that Nadine had gone and spent near $2,000 on baitfish, which was wrong on both counts, but I didn't correct it, because correcting a thing at the diner only feeds it. My nearest neighbor, a man named Harlan, who farms the section to my east and keeps a truck so clean I've never understood how he does it, living on dirt, drove up to my fence line that same week and rolled his window down and looked out at the pond where the little fish were settling into their new water. He wasn't unkind about it. Harlan is never unkind, which is somehow worse than if he were, because you can't get mad at him. He just said, real slow, "What are you going to do with 9,000 bluegill on 40 acres, Nadine?" And I told him I was farming. That was all I said. I told him I was farming, and he nodded like a man who'd decided not to argue with a woman who'd clearly lost the thread. And he rolled his window back up and drove on toward town, and I watched his clean truck get smaller down the road, and I thought, well, we'll see. I didn't know yet what the fish knew. I didn't know yet what the water was going to do. All I had was my father's notebook and a feeling in my chest that felt less like confidence and more like stubbornness, wearing confidence's coat. Now I want to tell you about my reasons, because a person doesn't do a thing like this out of nothing. And I'd hate for you to think I was just a foolish old woman throwing money in a hole in the ground. My father raised catfish and a little corn on this same 40 acres for most of my growing up years. And he was not a sentimental man about it. He was a man who watched things. When I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, there was a summer so dry the creek that fed the low pasture went to nothing but a string of green puddles, and the neighbors were hauling water for their stock, and my father took me down to the old spring pond in the back corner, the one that had been there since before his father's time. And he crouched down and put his hand flat on the water. And he said, "Feel how cold that is." And I felt it, and it was cold, colder than any water had a right to be in August. And he said, "This one never quits. There's water coming up under here from someplace deep, and it don't care what the sky does." And then he said, "The thing I have carried my whole life." He said, "When everybody else is dry, the one who's still got water is the one who gets to name the price." I was 9. I didn't understand it. I understood it as a thing my father said, the way children understand the things their parents say, as weather that passes over them. But it went in somewhere and it stayed. And 40 years later, when I decided to put in that new pond, I put it in that same back corner over that same cold spring, because some part of me had never stopped believing my father about the water. The notebook I found the winter before, when I was cleaning out the tack room in the old barn, getting ready to sell off some of his tools. It was down in a wooden apple crate, under a coil of rotted lead rope, a marbled composition book, the black and white kind school children used to carry, and the cover had gone soft at the corners, and the pages had that brown color pencil gets after 50 years. His handwriting was small and careful, the handwriting of a man who'd only had schooling through the 8th grade, and was proud of every letter of it. Most of it was ordinary. Feed weights, fish counts, the dates the catfish spawned, year after year, going back to the 60s. Rainfall tallies in the margin. He kept track of things the way some men pray, steady, and without expecting an answer. And I sat on an overturned bucket in that cold barn and read my dead father's handwriting by the light of the one bulb that still worked out there, and I'll admit to you that I cried a little because there is nothing like a dead man's handwriting to make him briefly alive again. But I put the notebook back in the crate that night. I wasn't ready. I told myself I'd read it proper come spring, and I did what I do, which is I postponed the important thing, because the important thing has a way of asking something of you. What I did not do that winter night was read all the way to the back. If I had, I'd have found the page that changed everything a good 3 months sooner than I did. But I didn't, and so the notebook sat in the crate through the worst of the cold while I made my plans out of half-remembered things and stubbornness. And I ordered my fish, and I let the extension man tell me I was wrong, and I let Harlan give me his slow, sorry look over the fence. It was only in May, after the fingerlings had been in the water a few weeks and I'd gotten it into my head that I ought to know exactly what I'd committed myself to, that I brought the notebook up to the house and sat with it at the kitchen table under a good light and read it front to back, the way you're supposed to read a thing like that. And that is where I found it. Near the back, on a page by itself, in that small, careful hand. My father had written a single line and underlined it twice, and beside it he'd drawn a little arrow pointing to the corner of the page, and the line said, "Spring pond runs 58 all summer. Wams, bluegill spawn slow, but flesh stays firm. Cold water is the whole thing. Ask the buyers why." And under that, smaller, like an afterthought he'd never finished, he'd written 3 words with a question mark that he had never answered in all his careful pages. Muck bottom test. And I sat there at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold, the same as it had gone cold the morning the truck came, and I read that line about the cold water being the whole thing, and I felt the hair stand up on my arms, because here is what I hadn't understood, standing there in April letting a young man in a clean jacket tell me my ground was wrong. My father wasn't stocking that pond with bluegill by accident, and he wasn't doing it for the bass. He was doing it because of the water. That spring underneath keeps the pond at 58 degrees straight through the hottest part of summer, when every other pond and lake in 3 counties is pushing 80 and going green and warm and slow. and a bluegill raised in cold water grows slower. That part the extension man got right, but a bluegill raised in cold water grows different. The flesh comes in firm and white, and it doesn't get that muddy, warm water taste that most folks around here just accept as the way bluegill is. My father had figured that out sometime back in his years of watching, and he'd written it down. And he'd left it for whoever came after, and whoever came after turned out to be me. 40 years late and only just in time. Ask the buyers why. I didn't even know yet who the buyers were. But I knew now that I hadn't bought 9,000 baitfish. I'd bought 9,000 of something my father had already proven would be worth more than anybody around here believed, in exactly the right corner of ground, over exactly the right cold water, and all I had to do was be patient enough to let it come true. So I decided sitting there that I would stop apologizing for the pond, and I would start paying attention to it the way my father had, and I would find out whether the old man was right. The first thing I did was stop trusting my memory and start trusting a thermometer. I bought a long-line pond thermometer, the kind on a cord you can drop to different depths, and I paid $19 for it and considered it the best money I'd spent since the fish themselves. And every morning that summer, before it got hot, I'd walk down to the pond in the gray light with my coffee, and I'd drop that thermometer down to about 4 feet and hold the cord and wait and read it. And every morning, all through May and June and into the worst of July, it read 57, 58, 59 degrees, steady as a heartbeat, while the air above it climbed into the 90s, and the neighbor ponds you could see off across the sections. My father hadn't been guessing. That water was coming up cold from someplace deep, and it didn't care what the sky did, exactly like he'd told me when I was 9, with his hand flat on the old spring pond. I kept a notebook of my own, now a spiral one, from the drugstore, and I wrote the temperature down every morning the way he had, and I found that the writing of it settled something in me. I was doing what he'd done. I was watching. And the more I watched, the more I understood that the coldness wasn't a problem to be overcome, the way the extension men had treated it. The coldness was the entire point. The coldness was the product. But knowing your water is cold and knowing what to do with a cold water bluegill are two different things. And I want to be honest that through most of that first summer, I did not have a buyer. I did not have a plan for selling, and I had a growing pile of feed receipts that made my heart sink every time I added them up. I was feeding those 9,000 fish a floating pellet at $18 a bag, and I was going through better than a bag a week once they got some size on them. And by the end of that first summer, I had put close to $500 of feed into the water on top of the $990 I'd paid for the fish. $1,490. Near enough? Into a pond that the county's own man had told me would clear $400 a year if I was lucky. There were nights I lay awake and did that arithmetic and heard the extension man's gentle voice and Harlan's slow question. And I'll own that, on those nights the stubbornness wore thin, and I wondered if I was exactly the foolish old woman the diner thought I was. But then morning would come, and I'd walk down and drop that thermometer and read 58. And I'd think about my father's hand on the water, and I'd think, no, not yet. Give it the time it asked for. The fish are doing what fish do. The water is doing what the water does. The only thing that could ruin this is me getting scared and quitting before the thing had a chance to prove itself, and so I didn't quit. I fed the fish, and I read the water, and I waited, and that is the whole of what I did through the summer and fall of 2019, and it does not make for exciting telling, but patience never does. That other line in the notebook nagged at me too, the one he never finished. Muck bottom test? I didn't know what he'd meant to check, but I knew my father didn't write a word down without a reason. So late that first fall, when the fish were bedded down for the cold and I had time, I took a length of pipe and drove it down into the pond bottom near the deep end and pulled up what came with it. Not mud. Muck. The real thing. That fine black organic muck that builds up over decades where cold water and slow decay do their quiet work. The kind of bottom that grows the insect life and the plankton that a fish feeds on when you're not looking. My father had suspected it and never gotten around to testing it. And there it was, thick and black on the end of my pipe, and I understood then that the cold spring wasn't just keeping the water cool, it was feeding a whole slow, rich world down in that dark that my 9,000 fish were living off of, on top of the pellets I was paying for. It meant those bluegill were growing on more than feed. It meant, though I couldn't have proven it yet, that they were going to taste like something. I stood there at the edge of my pond, in the cold, with a pipe full of black muck in my hand, and for the first time since April I felt something that wasn't stubbornness. It felt like being right. It's a quiet feeling. It doesn't announce itself, but you know it when it comes. The winter of 2020 came and went, and the fish came through it fine. Cold water fish in cold water, and by the spring they had size on them, most of them running 6 to 8 inches, which for a slow-grown bluegill is a good honest fish. And that spring I finally did the thing my father's note had told me to do without my understanding it. I went and I found the buyers. I got in my truck and I drove 2 hours to the city and I walked into the back doors of restaurants, the good ones, the kind with white tablecloths where a plate of fish costs more than I spend on groceries in a week, and I brought a cooler with a dozen of my fish on ice, cleaned and filleted the night before. And I want to tell you that the first 3 places waved me off before I got a sentence out, because that is the truth. And I promised you the truth. An old farm woman with a cooler is not what those kitchens are expecting to see. But the 4th place, the chef came out himself, a serious young man with tired eyes and burned scars up both forearms, and he looked in my cooler, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. And then he took one fillet up in his hand and turned it to the light and pressed it with his thumb. And I watched him do exactly what my father must have done 100 times, which is, he read the flesh with his hands. Firm, white. No, give to it. And he asked me where I got them, and I told him I raised them myself in cold spring water on my own ground, and he said, "This isn't pond bluegill." And I said, "It's exactly pond bluegill. It's just cold water pond bluegill." And he went quiet again, that particular quiet, and then he said one word. He said, "Exceptional." And he asked me how many I could get him. That was the turn, but the turn didn't become the whole story until the sky did what my father always knew the sky might do, because 2020 dried up. I don't have to tell anybody who was here what that summer was. The rain quit in June, and it did not come back. The creeks went to string of puddles the way I remembered from when I was a girl, and the neighbor ponds that had been warm and green went low, and warmer, and greener, and then some of them started to go wrong. When a warm pond gets low in a drought, and the water heats up past the 80s, the oxygen goes out of it, and the fish die. Whole ponds turned. I heard about it at the diner, which had stopped telling the story about foolish Nadine and her bait fish, and started telling stories about so-and-so who'd lost his whole base pond in a week, floating dead along the bank in the heat. The catfish operations, 2 counties over, were pulling their stock early and dumping them on a market that didn't want them because everybody was dumping at once. The whole warm water fish business in the region seized up and started dying in the heat, and the price of anything that came out of the water and tasted clean went up and up and up. And my pond sat at 58 degrees. Every morning, I walked down in that killing heat with my coffee, and I dropped my thermometer, and it read 58, 59, 60 at the very worst of it, while the world above baked. That cold spring my father had put his hand on when I was 9 years old came up out of the deep ground, just as cold and steady in the worst drought in 40 years as it did in a wet spring, because it did not care what the sky did. Exactly like he'd told me. And my 9,000 fish, which by then had grown and spawned and become a whole population, lived on in cold, clean water, while ponds all around me turned over and died. I didn't lose a fish to the heat, not one. And the chef with the tired eyes who'd said exceptional was calling me now, and so were 3 other kitchens he'd told, because when the warm water fish went bad and scarce across the whole region, The handful of us with cold, clean product became the only ones with anything worth putting on a plate. I went more or less overnight from a foolish old woman with baitfish to the only supplier of firm cold water bluegill for 100 miles at a moment when there was no competition because the competition was floating dead in warm ponds. My father's line came true in front of me, the one he'd said with his hand on the water when I was 9. When everybody else is dry, the one who's still got water is the one who gets to name the price. I named it. I'd been getting $1.50 a pound dressed, which already had me astonished. By the height of that drought, I was getting $4 a pound, and the kitchens were glad to pay it, and I still couldn't grow them fast enough. I want to be careful here not to make it sound like I got rich, because I didn't, and my father would haul off and correct me if I let you think that. But I'll give you the honest numbers, because the numbers are the proof, and my father believed in proof. That first full-selling year from the spring of 2020 through the following spring, I sold something better than 4,000 dressed fish. And after my feed and my fuel driving to the city and the ice and the rest of it, I cleared a little over $11,000 off a pond the county man had told me would give me $400 in a good year. $11,000 off $990 of fingerlings and one dead man's underlined line in a notebook. And it wasn't the money that got me, though the money certainly got the attention of the drawer where the envelope was. It was that every single thing my father had written down turned out to be exactly true. The cold water was the whole thing. The flesh stayed firm. The buyers, when I finally asked them, told me why in their own words. The same why he'd known 40 years before them. He'd been right, and he'd been alone in being right, and he'd never gotten to see it pay, and I got to see it pay for him, which is a debt I don't know how you settle except by doing what I'm doing right now, which is telling it. Harlan came up to my fence line late that fall in his clean truck and rolled his window down the way he had the year before when he'd asked me what I was going to do with 9,000 bluegill. And he sat there a minute looking out at my pond, which was the only pond in view that wasn't drought low and dying, sitting there cold and dark and alive. In the worst dry year any of us could remember. And I waited, because I had learned to wait. And Harlan, who is never unkind and never showy, finally said, real slow, "Well, your fish didn't die. Anyhow." That was the whole of it. Your fish didn't die, anyhow. From Harlan? That is a brass band and a parade. I said, no, they didn't. And he nodded, and he looked at that pond a moment longer, and then he rolled his window back up and drove on toward town. Same as always. And I watched his clean truck get smaller down the road exactly like the year before. Except, this time, I wasn't thinking, we'll see. This time I already knew. And I'll tell you. Standing there in the cooling evening, watching my neighbor drive off having admitted about as much as a man like Harlan is built to admit, I felt closer to my father than I had at his funeral. Because at his funeral, I only had my grief. And here I had his notebook come true, his hand on the water made real 40 years on. His patience proven in a dry year he never lived to see. So, that's the story of the 9,000 bluegill and the drought that turned an old woman with baitfish into the only supplier in the county. I still keep my thermometer on its cord by the back door, and I still walk down most mornings in the gray light with my coffee, and drop it, and read the water, 5859, steady as a heartbeat, and I write it in the spiral notebook, the way my father wrote in his marbled one, because a person ought to write things down for whoever comes after. I put his notebook up on the shelf where I keep the family things, and sometimes on a hard night I take it down and read that underlined line and those 3 unfinished words, muck bottom, question mark, test, and I think about how a man can watch a thing for 40 years and know it in his bones and still not get to see it come true. And how the least his daughter can do is finish the sentence he started. The extension man was not wrong about the arithmetic he could see. He just couldn't see the water under the ground, and he didn't stay long enough to learn that the coldness he called a problem was the whole product. That's the thing I've come to believe, standing at that pond in every kind of weather. The difference between a foolish bet and a wise one is usually just whether you were patient enough and whether somebody who watched before you left you a note. My father used to say that the sky can take everything a man has in a single dry summer, but it can't touch what comes up cold from underneath. And I didn't understand that for most of my life, and now I understand it well enough to have made my living off it. If you've got your own piece of ground everybody told you was wrong, or your own old note from somebody gone that you haven't finished reading yet, I'd truly like to hear about it down in the comments, because I believe most of us are sitting on something cold and deep that the sky can't touch, if we'd only be patient enough to let it prove itself. And if any part of this meant something to you, go on and subscribe. And I'll keep telling you what the water taught me.